And welcome back to my program. Election day is a little over a week away. And in spite of the fact that you'd think everything was being order, we're still having lawsuits galore all over the country that are raising questions about voter ID laws. Do you have to show an ID, a picture ID, to go in and vote? It's become very, very controversial, primarily uh, advocates for those who are less affluent, poorer, African Americans in particular, are arguing that it's a burden on them to have a photo ID. And I'm having been the insurance commissioner, the secretary of state, someone involved in politics, and also the chief elections officer in Louisiana for 8 years. I wrote the election code. I've been very supportive of those who want to vote, who want to be able to make it easy to vote. I think we should have online voting and absentee voting through the mail, particularly for our servicemen overseas. I'm very open to any number of ways to vote, but you need to show an ID. I just don't think that's that big of a burden. I went to absentee vote. Let me give you an interesting story. I went to absentee vote earlier. I've already voted. Went to the State Archives building, which is in Louisiana, a really great facility, which is the repository of all the state history. And I built that archives building, and that is the location for absentee voting in Baton Rouge, one location, one of many locations, but a big location. So I go over, and of course, I built the archives as Secretary of State. Had a lot of old friends there. We talked for a good bit. We visited. And then remember, I'm the chief elections officer for 8 years. I wrote the election code. All the election officials knew me. So we reminisced and talked about old times. Then it was time for me to vote. I said, well, can I get my ballot? Sure, Mr. Brown, show us a picture ID. And I had to kind of laugh because everybody knew who I was, but I still had to show my picture ID. But then I got thinking, look at all the other areas, and how do you survive, quite frankly, in this country today without a picture ID? I have to get the picture ID. I'm taking a trip in a day or two. When I get in the airplane, picture ID. When I went to the bank and cash a check to get a little money, picture ID. When I got my prescription at the drugstore last week, a picture ID. When I went to the post office to pick up a package, picture ID. When you buy car insurance, picture ID. You know, if you go to a pawn shop and you want to sell something at a pawn shop, they ask you for a picture ID because a lot of things are being fenced or stolen goods being stolen. You want to buy a gun, picture ID. If you want to go to the Social Security office, picture ID. The welfare office, picture ID. So those who are expressing concerns about the picture ID have to have it to go to a welfare office or the Social Security office, but they raise questions about going to the polls and voting. I don't think it's that big of an imposition, quite frankly. We do it throughout our daily lives. In this time of all the additional security going on in this country, it's going to be more and more required in more and more things that you do. I went to check my phone bill here last week, picture ID, to be sure who I was. So virtually everything I'm doing, from my health at the drugstore to my cell phone, everything I do, you got to have the picture ID. What's the big deal of going to show the picture ID to vote? Again, I don't believe there's a lot of voter fraud involving our election process. I worked with Secretary of States all over the country for many years, and we build in checks and balances for voter fraud. And you're only dealing with one vote. So to think that someone's going to scam and come in over one particular vote, it might make a difference in some small local election, but it's just not realistic. Just doesn't happen. Having said that, the photo ID, in my opinion, is not that big of an imposition. So if you're going to the polls and voting virtually any place in the United States, have your picture ID, have your driver's license. If you don't have a driver's license, if you don't drive, the state, in every instance, have to give you a free picture ID. So there's all kinds of ways to skin this cat, and throwing up the roadblocks. I would say it has become an issue for Republicans to push in their efforts to suppress voter turnout. Don't think it makes that much difference in suppressing voter turnout, but it's become a partisan issue. That's unfortunate. I wish it had not been. But as far as picture IDs, it's something I think you ought to have. I'll be back right after this message.